by way of just introduction, if you don't know who my father is, I'll list some professional accomplishments, but then I'll share one story. My father, I think now you're at two schools, right? You're a professor of philosophy at Talbot and at Houston Christian University. I think that, right? That's correct. Okay. So 2 professorships. He has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Birmingham in England and a PhD in theology from the University of Munich in Germany. He's written over 100 professional articles, published over 30 books. And I just learned this yesterday. According to ChatGPT, he is the number 5 greatest of all time apologists for Christianity. So check that yourself. I did not know that. A very robust resume, but like I said, given that he's my father, I think you're probably expecting me to share something more personal. And here's one thing I'll say. For those of you who are partners here at the church, one thing, I've been coming here for 5 years. One of the things that I hear over and over again from Brad is the desire to finish well. Right? Like that's the thing that Brad talks about over and over again. And Dad, like you're finishing well. Like you're absolutely doing it. This is a man who has dedicated his entire life to convincing people about the truth of Christianity. And he does that even now to this day. So very excited for you to be here and be a part of the community, and come on up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know you're wondering, how did a guy my size produce someone like John? I think he was supposed to be identical twins and the cells didn't split. But seriously, I am absolutely thrilled to be here tonight. You see, this is the first time in my life that I have ever partnered with my son John in ministry. In raising the children, Jan and I never tried to push the kids to follow us into the ministry. And in fact, both of them went into business professionally. And so we were very surprised when we learned in recent times that John's been teaching apologetics here at Austin Ridge. And we were so thrilled to hear about that, and then even more thrilled to get this invitation to be with you tonight and to partner with him in this seminar. So this is a personal privilege and delight for me to be with you here tonight. Now, the topic that we're to cover tonight is faith and science, friends or foes? Back in 1896, the president of Cornell University, Andrew Dixon White, published a book entitled A History of the Warfare Between Science and Theology in Christendom. And under White's influence, the metaphor of warfare to describe the relations between science and Christianity became very widespread in the first half of the 20th century. The culturally dominant view, even among Christians, was that science and Christianity are not allies in the search for truth, but rather adversaries. To illustrate, several years ago, I had a debate with a philosopher on the topic, science and religion, are they mutually irrelevant, at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. And as I walked onto the campus, I saw that the students sponsoring the debate had advertised it with large banners and posters proclaiming science versus Christianity. The students were perpetuating the same warfare mentality that had been propagated by Andrew Dixon White more than a century before. What has happened, however, is that in the second half of the 20th century, historians and philosophers of science have come to realize that this supposed history of warfare is a fiction. For over 300 years, from the founding of modern science in the 1500s Until the end of the 19th century, the relationship between Christianity and science can best be described as an alliance. Up until the late 19th century, scientists were typically Christian believers who saw no conflict between their faith and their science. People like Kepler, Boyle, Maxwell, Faraday, Kelvin, and so on. The idea of a warfare between science and Christianity is a relatively recent invention of the late 19th century. It was carefully nurtured by secular thinkers who wanted to undermine the cultural dominance of Christianity in the West and to replace it with naturalism, the view that only the physical world is real. And they were amazingly effective at pushing through their agenda. But historians and philosophers during the second half of the 20th century began to realize that the idea of a warfare between Christianity and science is a gross oversimplification. White's book is now regarded as something of a bad joke, a distorted and one-sided piece of propaganda. So today, a flourishing dialogue between science and theology is going on in North America and Europe. Science and faith have discovered that they have important mutual interests and important contributions to make to each other. People who don't like this can choose not to participate in the dialogue, but that's not going to shut down the dialogue or render it meaningless. So tonight, I'd like to explore with you 4 ways in which science and Christian faith are allies in the quest for truth. 1, the origin of the universe. 2, the fine-tuning of the universe for life. 3, the origin of life. And 4, the evolution of complex life forms. Number 1, then, the origin of the universe. One of the main doctrines of the Christian faith is that God created the universe out of nothing a finite time ago. The Bible begins with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The Bible thus teaches that the universe had a beginning. This doctrine was repudiated both by ancient Greek philosophy as well as modern atheism. And then in 1929, the discovery of the expansion of the universe dramatically verified this doctrine. As you trace the expansion back in time, all the galaxies in outer space get closer and closer and closer together until finally the entire universe was shrunk down to a state of infinite density called the singularity about 14 billion years ago. Nothing existed prior to the singularity. It represents the origin of the universe, not only of all matter and energy, but even of physical space and time themselves. Physicists John Barrow and Frank Tipler explain, at this singularity, space and time came into existence. Literally, nothing existed before the singularity. So if the universe originated at such a singularity, we would truly have a creation ex nihilo, that is out of nothing. Against all expectation, science thus verified this biblical prediction. Robert Jastrow, the head of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, envisions it this way. The scientist has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Well, as you can imagine, scientists explored various ways to try to avert the beginning of the universe and to regain an eternal universe. Some suggested an oscillating model in which the universe goes through an infinite series of expansions and contractions, one after another from eternity past. Others speculated that our universe might have been a fluctuation in a prior vacuum state of fluctuating energy. Still others, like Stephen Hawking, tried to avoid a beginning by suggesting a theory of quantum gravity. But none of these efforts succeeded in restoring an eternal universe. Instead, 20th century cosmology saw a parade of failed theories trying to avert the absolute beginning predicted by the standard Big Bang model. Although advances in astrophysical cosmology have required various revisions to the standard model, nothing has called into question its fundamental prediction of a beginning of the universe. J.M. Wersinger, who is professor of physics at Auburn University, wrote, "At first, the scientific community was very reluctant to accept the idea of a birth of the universe. Not only did the Big Bang model seem to give in to the Judeo-Christian idea of a beginning of the world, but it also seemed to call for an act of supernatural creation. It took time, observational evidence, and careful verification of predictions made by the Big Bang model to convince the scientific community to accept the idea of a cosmic genesis. The Big Bang is a very successful model that imposed itself on a reluctant scientific community." The Big Bang theory thus agrees with the Bible's doctrine of creation. Now, this can have life-changing implications. For example, when Jan and I were studying in Germany, we met a scientist named Eva Drescher. Eva Drescher was a prominent Polish physicist, even had a sound wave named after her. And one day, the conversation turned to the subject of God. And Eva said to Jan and me, "Physics has destroyed my belief in God. As I look out at the universe, all I see is darkness. And as I look in at my own heart, all I see is darkness." And I thought, wow, what a poignant description of the human predicament. Darkness without and darkness within. Well, at that point, Jan said, "Well, you should read Bill's doctoral dissertation. He uses physics to prove the existence of God." And Eva said she was interested in reading it. So we gave her my doctoral dissertation, which had not yet been published. And over the next few days, she became increasingly excited as she read it. She said, "I know these men that you're quoting. These are colleagues and scientists." When she finally got to the end of the dissertation, she gave it back to us and said, "Thank you for restoring my belief in God. I do believe in God after all." And we said to her, "Well, would you like to know him personally?" And she said, "Of course." And so we made an appointment to meet her for dinner that night at a restaurant. And meanwhile, that afternoon, Jan and I made from memory a handmade 4 spiritual laws to share with Eva. And after dinner that evening, we opened it up and began, "Just as there are physical laws that govern the physical universe, so there are spiritual laws that govern your relationship with God." And she said, "What? Physical laws? Spiritual laws? This is just for me." And by the time we got to the end of the booklet where it shows the 2 circles, one with Christ in the life and one with Christ outside the life, and we asked her, "Which circle best represents your life?" she clapped her hand over the diagram and said, "Oh, this is so personal. I cannot answer now." And we said, "That's fine. Let us just explain to you how you can give your life to Christ, should you want to later on." And we went through a prayer of invitation with her, and then we went home that evening. Well, the next day we saw Eva again, and she was radiant with joy. And she told us how she had gone home that night, knelt down by her bed, and prayed to commit her life to Christ. And she flushed all of the wine and the tranquilizers that she was on down the toilet. She was a transformed person. Well, Jan and I knew she'd need some follow-up, so we gave her a Good News Bible. And after that, our paths parted for some months. But after several months, we saw her again at a conference, and she was still beaming with joy. And she said to us that her most precious possessions were her Good News Bible and her handmade 4 spiritual laws. It was probably one of the most dramatic examples I've ever seen of God using apologetics to bring a person to a personal relationship with Christ. Number 2, the fine-tuning of the universe for life. Central to the biblical doctrine of creation is that the universe is the product of God's design. The Bible says God created the heavens. He is the God who formed the earth and made it. He established it and did not create it a waste place, but formed it to be inhabited. Only recently have scientists begun to discover how incredible a feat it is to design a universe habitable by life forms. Scientists originally thought that whatever the initial conditions of the universe might have been, eventually the universe would somewhere evolve the complex life forms that we see today. But during the last 50 years or so, scientists have been stunned by the discovery of how complex and delicate a balance of initial conditions must be given in the Big Bang itself in order for the universe to permit the existence of intelligent life anywhere in the cosmos. Discoveries have repeatedly disclosed that the existence of life depends upon a delicate balance of physical constants and quantities given in the Big Bang. If any one of these were to be slightly altered, the balance would be destroyed and life would not exist. In fact, the universe appears to have been incomprehensibly fine-tuned from the moment of its inception for the production of intelligent life. For example, changes in the gravitational force or in the electromagnetic force by only 1 part in 10 to the 40th power would have prevented the existence of stars like our sun, making life impossible. There are scores of these initial conditions which must not only be individually fine-tuned, but must also be fine-tuned in relation to one another in order for life to exist. So it's not merely like all the roulette wheels in Monte Carlo turning up a certain set of numbers. It's more like all the roulette wheels in Monte Carlo turning up a certain set of numbers, and those numbers also having to stand in certain ratios to one another. For example, the number on one wheel must be 7 times the number on another wheel, but 1/3 the number on another wheel. Clearly, the odds against the existence of a life-permitting universe are incomprehensibly overwhelming. John Barrow, the late Oxford physicist, gives a good illustration of what this is like. He says, put a red dot on a piece of paper and let it represent our universe. Now, vary some of those initial conditions just a hair and let that represent a different universe. If it's life permitting, put a red dot. If it's life prohibiting, put a blue dot. Now do it again, and do it again until the paper is filled with dots. You know what you wind up with? You get a sea of blue with only a few pinpricks of red here and there. Now, sometimes people will say, but if the universe were not fine-tuned for our existence, we wouldn't be here to be surprised about it. Given that we are here, we should expect the universe to be fine-tuned. But such reasoning is logically fallacious. We can show this by means of a parallel illustration. Imagine that you're traveling abroad and arrested on trumped up drug charges and dragged in front of a firing squad of 100 trained marksmen, all with rifles aimed at your heart to be executed. You hear the command given, ready, aim, fire. And you hear the deafening roar of the guns. And then you observe that you're still alive, that all of the 100 marksmen missed. Now, what would you conclude? Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised that they all missed. After all, if they hadn't all missed, I wouldn't be here to be surprised about it. Given that I am here, I should expect them all to miss. Nothing to be explained here. Well, of course not. You would immediately suspect that they all missed on purpose, that the whole thing was a setup, engineered for some reason by someone. You wouldn't be surprised that you don't observe that you're dead, because if you were dead, you wouldn't be there to observe it. But you should be very surprised that you do observe that you are alive, given the improbability of all of the 100 trained marksmen missing. In exactly the same way, given the incomprehensible improbability of the fine-tuning of the universe for life, it is reasonable to conclude that this is not due to chance, but to design. So there's an evident explanation for the cosmic fine-tuning, intelligent design. Given the incomprehensible improbability of the initial conditions of the universe being fine-tuned for life, it's far more plausible to believe, as the Bible says, that this was the result of intelligent design than to believe that the universe, when it popped into being, uncaused, out of nothing, just happened to be, by chance, fine-tuned to an incomprehensible precision for the existence of life. Number 3, the origin of life. Despite the incredible fine-tuning of the universe for life, the fact remains that these initial cosmic conditions do not guarantee that life will arise anywhere in the universe. Life could not come to exist without them, but they do not guarantee that life will come to exist. In fact, even given the finely tuned initial conditions of the universe, the origin of life remains astronomically improbable. According to the Bible, God is the ultimate source of physical life on earth. Genesis 1 describes the condition of the early earth as an uninhabitable waste, a primordial ocean covering the earth. Over the next 4 days, God then gradually creates living organisms. He successively commands the earth to bring forth vegetation, the waters to bring forth swarms of living creatures, the earth to bring forth living creatures. Unlike the vegetation, these living creatures have within them the breath of life, just as God later breathed into man the breath of life. The psalmist reflects, when you send forth your spirit, they are created, but when you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. So in the biblical view, God is the ultimate cause of life on earth. Scientifically speaking, the origin of life remains a mystery. Most of us were probably taught in high school that life originated in the primordial soup through chance chemical reactions. Back in 1950, Stanley Miller was able to synthesize amino acids by passing electric sparks through a methane gas. While amino acids are just lifeless carbon compounds, proteins are made out of amino acids, and proteins are found in living things, and so the hope was that somehow the origin of life would soon be explained. What the average layman doesn't realize, however, is that these old chemical origin of life scenarios prove futile. There are two steps that have to be taken in order for life to originate. First, the basic building blocks of life have to form. Second, these building blocks have to be organized into a cell. Neither step is understood. With respect to the first step, there are four major building blocks that have to form: carbohydrates, proteins, DNA and RNA, and fats or lipids. These are the heavyweight macromolecules that are essential to living things. Nobody understands where they came from. Pierre Louisi, who is a Swiss origin of life scientist, writes in his book, The Emergence of Life, you can have all the low molecular weight prebiotic compounds in any amount you like, but you will not start life without the ordered macromolecules. I will insist on that because it is one of the unanswered questions, how to make them. And because it is a question that is not taken seriously enough in the literature, the fact remains that until now there has been no clear way to obtain ordered sequences by prebiotic means. The formation of these macromolecules by chance alone is so astronomically improbable that some scientists have felt forced to appeal to the reaches of outer space in order to explain them. The claim is that these macromolecules formed somewhere else in the universe and were carried to the Earth by comets and meteorites. But although lightweight molecules have been discovered in samples taken from meteorites and asteroids, none of the heavyweight macromolecules that are the building blocks of life have ever been found. In any case, the odds against the chance origination of the macromolecules are so daunting that even if the entire universe were filled with primordial soup, the chances of life's originating would not be appreciably improved. Nor have scientists been able to synthesize such macromolecules in the laboratory, despite millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours invested in the effort. A few scientists, desperate for an explanation, have hypothesized that if the universe is infinite in size, then no matter how improbable life is, it will originate somewhere by chance. In fact, if the universe is infinite, then life will come to exist by chance alone infinitely many times over throughout the universe. But the problem with this answer is that it can be used to explain away any improbable event, so that rational behavior becomes impossible. No matter how improbable something is, you could explain it away by saying that in an infinite universe, it would happen somewhere. But that makes rational decision-making impossible. Can you imagine the following dialogue taking place at a poker table in a West Texas saloon? Tex, you're a dirty, cheating skunk. Every time you deal, you get 4 aces. Well, Slim, I know it looks a mighty bit suspicious that every time I deal, I gets 4 aces. But you got to understand, in this here infinite universe of ours, there's an infinite number of poker games going on somewheres. So chances are that in some of them, every time I deal, I gets 4 aces. So put up that shooting iron and shut your yap and deal. Now, if you were old Slim, would you sit down for another hand of cards? I don't think so. On this kind of reasoning, we could never have any evidence that the universe is infinite. Because if the universe is infinite, then it becomes impossible to assess the probability or improbability of the evidence. And thus the objection is ultimately self-defeating and cannot be rationally affirmed. Now, all of this concerns just the synthesis of the basic building blocks of life by chance. But even if you managed to get the basic building blocks, the second step remains of getting them somehow assembled into a living cell. Even a single cell is so breathtakingly complex that scientists have essentially no understanding of how such a thing could have come to exist. University of Chicago biologist James Shapiro wrote last year in his book, Evolution, certain questions like the origin of the first living cells currently have no credible scientific answers. The cell biologist Franklin Harold, in his book, In Search of Cell History, agrees. He says how cells and their parts came to exist is, for all practical purposes, unknown. Harold concludes his chapter on the origin of cellular life on Earth with these poignant words: "For the present, we are in limbo. The natural path from the simple cosmic molecules to cells, from chemistry to biology, remains undiscovered. A path there must be, of that I am certain, or else we would not be here seeking it. I have a hunch that there's much more to the origin of life than current philosophy knows. When, or better, if we solve that mother of all conundrums, it will change our perspective on life, the universe, and all that. But where we should look for illumination, I cannot say." As a Christian, I read these words with amazement and bewilderment because the answer seems to be staring us in the face. Limbo is traditionally reserved for those who do not believe in God. And it's exactly the same here. The life-changing perspective anticipated by Harold is provided by God. How can he fail to see it? Near the end of his book, Harold puts it this way: in all of biology, possibly in all of science, there is no more profound mystery than the origin of cells and of life. Until we solve it, we cannot be sure that life grew naturally out of the lifeless world of chemistry and physics, and must entertain the possibility that the gulf between life and non-life was bridged with the assistance of forces that fall outside the reach of science as we understand it. So why not God? Harold confesses, "I still cherish a personal fantasy derived from science fiction that calls for the cosmic equivalent of Johnny Appleseed, a fabulous being that scoots about the galaxy, scattering life seeds. We live on one of Johnny's successes." Now, Harold quickly adds, "No, I don't take it seriously." Fine, but if such a naturalistic God is even worth mentioning, then what about the transcendent creator and designer of the Bible? Isn't he worth considering? Number 4, the evolution of complex life forms. Even given the fine-tuning of the initial conditions of the universe, even given the origin of cellular life itself, there's no guarantee that life would develop into complex multicellular organisms. So we must now consider the evolution of biological complexity. Genesis describes God's transformation of the earth into a habitable biosphere of plants and animals for man. Now, the interpretation of Genesis chapter 1 is a matter of considerable controversy among Christians. Some Christians take Genesis to describe a literal 6-day creation week, which took place about 10 to 20,000 years ago. But it seems that there are clues in the text of Genesis itself that a literal creation week is not intended. I think that a literal reading of Genesis 1 is one legitimate interpretation, but it cannot claim to be the only interpretation permitted by the text. For example, the seventh day is clearly not a 24-hour period of time, since it doesn't end with the phrase, "and it was evening, a seventh day." Rather, it represents God's Sabbath rest from creation, which still continues today. We are living in the seventh day. Or how about the creation of the sun on the fourth day? The expression, "and it was evening, and it was morning," in Hebrew refers to sunset and sunrise. But obviously, there cannot be any sunset or sunrise on the first 3 days if there was no sun. Also, the firmament that God created to separate the waters above from the waters below, and in which God placed the sun, the moon, and the stars, is clearly not a literal dome like an upside-down bowl resting on the earth at its horizon. For the celestial bodies are observed to move in the firmament, and that's why they could serve to mark seasons and years and days. Moreover, it's highly doubtful that the author of Genesis thought that the primordial ocean covering the earth drained away into lakes and rivers in just 24 hours. Compare his account of the flood of Noah, which returned the earth to its primordial condition. It took months and months for the flood to drain away and the mountains to become visible. Or again, on the third day we read, "And God said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees bearing fruit, each according to its kind upon the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, each according to its kind. And there was evening, and there was morning, a third day." Now, we all know how long it takes, for example, for trees to grow and blossom and bear fruit, unless we're to imagine this as occurring like in time-lapse photography, where the little sprouts burst out of the ground and suddenly grow into trees and then quickly blossom and bam, 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 the fruit pops out on the tree. This must have taken longer than 24 hours. I find it hard to believe that the author of Genesis wanted his readers to imagine things popping up like a film being run on fast forward. Now, notice I'm arguing this on the basis of the text itself, not on the basis of what science tells us. Historically, many Jews and Christians interpreted Genesis 1 figuratively. As the Jewish professor Nathan Aviazar points out in his book, In the Beginning. Aviazar quotes a number of ancient rabbinical scholars on Torah and Talmud to prove the point, and one could also quote early Christian church fathers like Irenaeus, Origen, Basil, and Augustine to show the same thing. I'm not denying that a literal reading of Genesis 1 is one legitimate interpretation of the text, but it cannot claim to be the only interpretation permitted by the text, nor does it represent the historic understanding of all Jews and Christians. But if I'm correct about this, then Genesis tells us virtually nothing about how God made the plants and animals. Did he create them out of nothing? Did he create them out of existing life forms? Did he use evolution to produce them gradually? These are scientific questions which the Bible does not address. The main point of the Genesis story is to tell us that God is the creator of everything in the world. The sun and the moon and the animals and the plants are just creatures. They're not deities. They're just things. God made them. And how he does so seems to be left open. Now, what that means is that the Christian is open to follow the evidence where it leads. And in that sense, we have a decided advantage over the non-Christian. For if God does not exist, then evolution is the only game in town. No matter how improbable the evidence, no matter what the evidence says, evolution's got to be true because there is nothing outside of nature to bring about biological complexity. And thus the naturalist conclusion is really determined in advance by his philosophy, not by the evidence. And this can be very liberating for people who want to place their faith in Christ. For example, several years ago, I was speaking at the University of Belfast in Ireland. And after my talk, I engaged an Irish student in conversation. And he said to me, in order to become a Christian, do I have to believe that God created the world in 6 24-hour days? And I said, oh, no, of course not. You don't have to believe that in order to be a Christian. And he threw his hands in the air and said, hallelujah. You see, he had been wanting to give his life to Christ, but he was prevented from doing so because he could not bring himself to believe in young earth creationism. And so this was a positive impediment to this fellow's coming to Christ. So let me just say a word about the scientific theory of biological evolution. I think one of the most important things for laymen to understand is that the theory of biological evolution has itself evolved. If we leave aside the theories of Charles Darwin's predecessors, there are 3 major stages in evolutionary theory. Stage 1 was Darwinism. This was Darwin's original theory of evolution, laid down in his book On the Origin of Species, 1859. Darwin's theory of evolution comprised 2 fundamental theses. Number 1, the common ancestry of all living things, and 2, natural selection as the explanation of evolutionary change. Darwin's theory was dead almost upon arrival. While his thesis of common ancestry quickly won the day, for 70 years following the publication of The Origin of Species, Darwin's thesis of natural selection was widely regarded as explanatorily inadequate. That led to stage 2, the modern synthesis. Formulated during the 1930s and 40s, the modern synthesis represented the marriage of Darwin's natural selection and Gregor Mendel's genetics. Its chief contribution was the thesis that the source of new characteristics is random genetic mutations. This theory, sometimes called neo-Darwinism, rapidly became orthodoxy among evolutionary biologists and prevailed almost till the close of the 20th century. Stage 3, the extended evolutionary synthesis. Proponents of this theory criticize the modern synthesis for its obsession with genetic mutations as the source of evolutionary change. They contend that new data from adjacent fields such as embryology, epigenetics, ecology, and social science now demand a wider theory. And the diagram on the screen illustrates the relation between the extended evolutionary synthesis, the modern synthesis, and Darwin's theory. And with each stage of the theory, the prior stage is regarded as explanatorily inadequate and outmoded. Now, the fact is that the modern synthesis really didn't offer very much by way of explanation of the causes of how organisms evolve over time. The modern synthesis postulated correlations between an organism's genetic makeup and its observable traits, but no causal mechanisms linking them. And as a result, the modern synthesis was unable to explain how evolutionary change happens. Creationists and proponents of intelligent design have long complained about the explanatory inadequacy of the modern synthesis, but they were uniformly ignored, probably because they were only able to poke holes in the theory without offering a credible alternative. But now, proponents of the extended evolutionary synthesis are making some of the very same criticisms. But don't think that the evolution of the theory of evolution has come to an end and that all the loose strings have been tied up. No. While the extended evolutionary synthesis exposed weaknesses in the modern synthesis and so opened up new avenues of research, many of the ideas of the extended evolutionary synthesis remain unproven, poorly understood, and controversial, so that the quest for a final theory must continue. The evolutionary biologist Eugene Koonin observes that what follows in a quote-unquote postmodern era is not a postmodern synthesis, but rather a postmodern state characterized by a pluralism of processes and patterns in evolution that defies any straightforward generalization. He says that it's too early to tell whether the paths currently being pursued can be combined into a new evolutionary synthesis in the foreseeable future. But he says, I will venture one confident prediction. Those celebrating the 200th anniversary of the origin of species in 2059 will see a vastly different landscape of evolutionary biology. So, in conclusion, when we consider the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life, the origin of life, and the evolution of biological complexity, not only is there no conflict between Christianity and science, but the existence of God makes good sense of what are otherwise inexplicable facts. Thank you for your attention.